Good. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our high school admissions webinar. My name is Jill Steinberg and I'm joined tonight with Maurice Frumkin. We want to tell you up front that this webinar is going to be recorded. So if you happen to have missed anything or if you have to leave early for whatever reason, it will be recorded and the recording will be sent to you automatically to your email that you registered with over the next couple of days. We also ask that you please hold your questions until the end. We do have time at the end for a Q&A session, and we will ask that you put your questions into the Q&A at the bottom. We are going to hold this webinar to 1 hour, so we'll leave about 10-15 minutes at the end for questions. And now, without further ado, I want to introduce you to our speaker, Maurice. I will speak to you in a short while about testing, but Maurice is going to speak to you first. He is the founder and president of NYC Admission Solutions. He's the former deputy executive director of high school enrollment with the New York City Department of Ed, where he trained directly with the pioneers of the largest school choice process in the nation, the NYC high school admissions process. Maurice is also a former middle and high school admissions officer with top New York City independent schools. So Maurice, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you so much for having me here today. And thanks everyone for your time. I know everyone is probably all zoomed out and we want to make the best use of your time for sure. So we'll pack as much information into the next hour as we possibly can. As Jill mentioned, my company is NYC Admission Solutions, and we serve families and schools across the city and beyond with everything from pre-K all the way up through college admissions. And we'll give our little 15-second public service announcement at the end. But we're here to talk to you. And of course, Jill, thank you again for having me here with Apple Ruth, who I will turn over this presentation to in a few minutes. So tonight, we're obviously here to talk about the largest choice process in the country, the New York City high school choice process. And if you live in New York City by now, you most likely know that you will be choosing from potentially a wide variety of types of schools, everything from charter schools to regular public schools, the specialized schools, which are a subset of the public schools, parochial, independent day, independent boarding schools, wide variety of choice in New York City, which is both a blessing and to some degree a curse because it is incumbent upon families to make the right decisions, obviously, for your family. So we're going to try to decipher this a little bit and try to demystify this process a little bit about applying to high school in New York City. Now, by now, if you're thinking about the different types of schools you may want to apply to and that may be suited for your family, you may recognize that for each major type of school, there tends to be a separate application process. Typically, you'll be developing a separate list for each of these major types of schools. There might be a unique test associated with each of the different major categories of schools. We preach this notion of casting the widest net possible and recommend choosing at least 2 or 3 different categories of schools. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a moment. And typically by the end of 7th grade, and I assume many of you are 6th and 7th grade families on the webinar tonight, typically by the end of 7th grade, we recommend that you will have, among other things, which we'll talk about later, started to develop a draft working list of schools for each of the categories separately for each of those categories, knowing that those lists will evolve over time, and especially as you get into the 8th grade year, which is really busy. But again, sticking to this notion, this rule of thumb of casting the widest net that you possibly can. And this is one of the reasons why, because for each of the major types of categories of schools that you'll apply to, you can end up with, in some cases, up to 1 offer for each of the categories. So if you're applying to 2 or 3 different categories, you're putting yourself in a position where you can end up with more choice. And I can tell you from having worked with a lot of families, after this whole process is over in 8th grade, many families are really, really thankful that they have chosen different types of schools and put themselves in a position where they can have some choices. Even if one of these categories of schools is not your preferred choice, it's nice to have some backup options. Now, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail with each and every bullet point that you see on the slide in front of you, but suffice it to say that if we're talking about, for many families in the spring of 7th grade, the kinds of things you're starting to do right now to lay the foundation for what's to come later on in the summer before 8th grade and in the fall 8th grade. Right now, you're just starting the exploration process to explore the different types of schools that are out there, maybe to start to attend some open houses, and they're out there, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Maybe to initiate, to start jotting down names of some schools, as Jill will talk about, to start to get a little bit more clarity on what test prep might mean for your child, what audition prep might mean for your child, and to start to identify key resources, whether it's your counselor, other consultants like us, or other resources, websites, and so forth that you might find beneficial. So again, this is sort of laying the foundation for what's to come later. And we've found over the years that while this doesn't have to be a terribly intense time of year, just by biting off little pieces, you can really set yourself up in an optimal way for what's to come later on. So I'm going to talk briefly about the different types of schools that you can consider. There are independent, or in New York City, what's called private high schools. So those two terms are used pretty interchangeably. And these are tuition-based schools that are very often defined by smaller class sizes. They're very often defined by an extensive selection of courses, their facilities, extracurricular activities. And we'll give you some names of some of these private schools, many of which you've probably heard of. What is important to know at this time of year is that the application process and the applications themselves for the private schools tend to be released by the end of the summer around Labor Day. So there's nothing you can do yet on a formal basis to start the application for the private schools. But eventually in the fall of 8th grade, especially starting in September, you'll start to apply to these schools, and the application process tends to culminate by the end of the year, by November and December, when you're completing all the different components of the applications, which I'll get to in a moment, ultimately resulting in decisions coming out in February of 8th grade. And these are just some examples of private schools in New York City that you've probably heard of. One of the things that differentiates the private school applications in New York City versus, I would probably say, most of the other types of applications to other schools is that it's time intensive. There's a lot, as you can see on the slide in front of you, there's a lot that goes into these applications. Many families will say it feels like you're applying to college because you've got everything from the preliminary forms and applications to interviews and essays and transcripts and everything that goes along with it. Some schools may also require testing. There are more schools because of COVID, I'm going to talk more about this in a moment, that have decided to go test optional, and the jury is still out whether or not that's going to carry into next year. Some schools require a student questionnaire, a group interview, et cetera, et cetera. You will find out again by the end of the summer, going into the early part of September, exactly what each private school's requirements are. And many schools throughout the New York City use a common application system called Ravenna, which also has very limited value right now. But eventually, as a family, if you're applying to independent schools in New York City, you will likely find yourself creating an account in this Ravenna system, and then taking advantage of the fact that a lot of the components that each school require are common components, and therefore can save you a lot of time when you're applying to multiple schools. As I alluded to a moment ago, there have been, as you can imagine, some impacts to the private school application process because of COVID. More schools have become test optional. Their processes have become almost 100%, in some cases 100% virtual. In some cases, they've asked for a greater body of work, knowing that kids have been going through really, really challenging times and a lot of adversity over the past year. And frankly, the enrollment and application process and level of competition among applicants has become a lot more unpredictable. So the process will continue to evolve for rising 7th graders for each school. And what we tend to see, even though many schools use the Ravenna system as a common application system, we tend to see that the requirements for each private school can vary slightly from school to school to school. So we'll learn more about that as time goes on. Now, that said, you can very easily go on to private school websites and start to get a sense of what the application process is like. Of course, there's the boarding school application process, which is distinguished by the fact that there are hundreds of schools nationwide and outside of the United States, obviously. These schools are defined by the fact that they're tuition based. Kids are living on campus, at least during the week. For some boarding schools, kids go home during the weekend or even every few weeks. So that varies by the individual school. There are smaller class sizes. Again, much like private day schools, they're known very much for their courses and extracurricular activities. And you can apply to as many boarding schools as you like, much like the private day schools. There's an incremental amount of work for every school that you apply to, because there are different requirements for each school and there's not a common application per se. Typically, these applications are due by December of 8th grade and decisions, whereas for the day schools, most of the decisions come out in February. For the boarding schools, most decisions come out in March of 8th grade. And then we have Catholic high school process, which is relatively simple compared to the private schools applications. Obviously, they're defined by religious orientation, although there are many students who are not necessarily Catholic that go to these schools. They are tuition based. Many of the Catholic schools are at significantly lower price points than the traditional private schools. Many of these schools are single gender. And when it comes to assessing candidates, these schools tend to look at everything from 6th through 8th grade transcripts. And these schools are also defined by the fact that many of them require an exam called the tax exam, which is the test of admission for Catholic high schools. And you can register, we'll give the website a little bit later, but you can register for the tax exam, usually starting in the early summer. And then, of course, we have charter schools, which are defined by the fact that they're complete lottery, they are free, they are separate from the New York City Department of Education application process. And charter schools are still defined by the fact that they give not only geographic priority, but priority to siblings. Also for charter schools, you have the luxury of applying to as many schools as you'd like. There's no limit. Most charter schools, the application process is super simple. It's easy to do. It doesn't take a lot of time. And the deadline tends to be for most charter schools April 1st of 8th grade. So you've got a lot of time for that. And decisions come out pretty quickly after that because it is simply a lottery system. Switching gears to the regular Department of Education, New York City high school admissions process. This process, you probably know by now, is defined by the fact that there are essentially 3 separate buckets of DOE schools that you may end up applying to. The first bucket is what I'll call the regular public high schools. The second bucket are the SHSAT schools, the infamous specialized high schools that require the SHSAT, and there are 8 of them that I'm going to show you in a moment. And the third bucket is the 9th specialized high school, LaGuardia High School, which did not require the SHSAT. So I like it when families start to consider these 3 separate buckets and 3 separate lists of schools. Not all of them are necessarily maybe the right fit for your child. But obviously all of these schools are free. There's a separate admissions process from the charter schools. And some of these schools have some kind of admissions priority structure and some admissions criteria depending upon the school you're applying to. Some are lottery based, some are not lottery based. We'll talk more about that in a moment. And there are hundreds and hundreds of these schools across the city. You apply by typically December in a normal year, and I'm assuming things will get a little bit more back to normal this year. You submit your application for the regular public high schools. There's a single application with 12 spots on it, and you apply to the specialized high schools separately from that main application. So we're going to get back to those points in a moment. There have, as you can imagine, been some significant impacts because of COVID to the public high school process as well. One of which is the fact that the academic screens that have been in place for certain schools is somewhat in flux. Now, they were adjusted this past year for current 8th grade families because of COVID. And we do not yet know what if any, academic screens will be in place for current 7th grade families that are going to be applying in the fall. So that is in flux. What we do know from the Department of Education is that geographic priorities, so schools that historically had given any kind of priority on the basis of where you live or where you go to school, but geographic priorities are going by the wayside and will be eliminated by the Department of Education. We also know that this past year, audition process for schools like LaGuardia and other schools that had some kind of audition was completely virtual. It's anybody's guess what's going to happen this year, but I suspect that there will still be likely some virtual components to even the audition process, but we just don't know that for sure yet from the DOE. And as you can imagine, timelines were significantly delayed this year. Separate from the main list of 12, we have the specialized high schools, which are defined by the fact that these are 9 schools out of 400 plus high schools throughout the city. You apply to them separately. For LaGuardia and for the SHSAT schools, you register for the SHSAT and for LaGuardia auditions in September of 8th grade. And to be considered for the SHSAT schools, you must take the SHSAT, which in a normal year is offered the end of October, beginning of November. We don't know the official dates yet, but we expect things will get a little bit more back to normal this year. And as you probably know, these are schools that are generally considered among the most highly selective in New York City. And these are the 9 specialized high schools. So 8 of them require the SHSAT. You might know, if you've been following the news, that literally last week, the Department of Ed announced that there were just over 4,200 offers made to, I want to say, around 25,000 kids that took the SHSAT this past year, which was down from previous years for a variety of reasons. But if you're interested in these 8 schools that you see on the top, you have to take the SHSAT. You register for the SHSAT in September. And the 9th specialized high school is LaGuardia. You don't take the SHSAT for LaGuardia, but there are 6 programs, 6 studios at LaGuardia that you can potentially audition for. LaGuardia offers this year have not come out yet. For this year, because of COVID, LaGuardia offers are coming out separately, along with all the other regular high school offers that are being made that for current 8th grade students. So by mid-May, within the next couple of weeks, we expect that current 8th graders will find out the results from their high school applications and from LaGuardia. They've already gotten their results from the SHSAT, as I said last week. And before I turn it over to Jill, just some really, really key basics, just some fundamental basics about the SHSAT. Again, you register in the fall. The offers are based on 3 things and 3 things alone. That is your score, your choices of the SHSAT schools which you make when you register for the test, the number of offers that are made to each of the SHSAT schools. In a normal year, things were a little bit different this year, but in a normal year, all of the results from the SHSAT, from LaGuardia, and from your regular public high school application are included in the same letter. One other thing that distinguishes the specialized high schools from all the other regular high schools in New York City is that there are no wait lists at all. And because you receive offers simultaneously from the specialized high schools and your regular list of 12 choices, if you receive multiple offers, the DOE typically gives you a little window, week or 2, to choose between those offers. So with that, I want to turn it over to Jill.
Great. Thanks so much, Maurice. Share here. Okay, this is me. Thanks so much. Hope that your head isn't spinning with all that information that Maurice has given you. Great information. I'm going to talk a little bit about the SHSAT. Apple Ruth, we tutor students for all the tests, but this is the one that's typically the most, that gets the most questions. And so I just want to jump in and talk a little bit about that test specifically. The test runs for 180 minutes. It has 2 sections, and an English language arts section and a math section. Each section has 57 questions, but only 47 of them actually count towards the score. There's revising and editing, reading comprehension. In the ELA section, all the questions are multiple choice. The math section has some grid in and some computational questions, but as I said, each section has 47 questions that actually count toward the score. Each section has these 10 field test questions. So the students are not really going to be able to determine which questions those are. So they have to try on every single question. You can't try to guess which ones. The Department of Ed throws those in there so that they can learn more about students. They can understand what they've learned in the school year, and they can help make the test better. That's why those questions are in there. The math section assesses skills for equations and expressions, geometry, number systems. It covers the learning standards up through 7th grade for the 8th grade test and up through 8th grade for the 9th grade test. Like some other standardized tests that offer the questions in difficulty order, the math problems are not in order of difficulty. So you have to just plow through. The ELA section is composed of all multiple choice questions. Again, they assess revising, editing, and reading comprehension. The revising and editing, the questions test your ability to recognize and correct language. The reading comprehension is your ability to understand and analyze what you've read. So the big question that we get is, how is the test scored? And I'm going to give you a brief overview of how it's scored. On the next slide, you'll see I included a link to a YouTube video, which includes someone explaining it in really, really great detail. So basically the way it's scored is that each student receives, you get 1 point for each correct answer, and that's out of the 47 questions on each section. And that score, let's say you got 40 questions correct on the section, that would be your raw score, the 40. Then what they do is they take your raw score and they put it through a statistical distribution based on a whole variety of things that is a secret, basically. They don't tell the public about the curve and how they get to the curve. They don't release the formulas that they're using to convert the raw score. So we don't know exactly how, and it varies from one year to the next. So from there, that score is the ELA and the math section is combined for your composite score. And that, in conjunction with your preferences, the way you've listed your preferences for the specialized high school, that's how they determine admissions for the specialized high school. And these are just some of the definitions that I was just saying. You have your raw score that goes through the curve, and you get your scaled score, and then you have the 2 scaled scores for each section. You add those together, that's your composite score. And here's the YouTube video that I had promised, where they give a much deeper dive into exactly how they think the curve is derived. So the next question, of course, is, what score do I need? Well, again, that's a little bit of a mystery, although parents over the years have been very forthcoming on the internet reporting what their child's score was and what school they got into. I'm sorry, I see a typo in front of Bronx Science. These are the low and high scores of parent reported scores. So parents, again, have reported them, my child got a 566 and he got into Stuyvesant. Well, that's now sort of like the low on the lower end. And then someone else said, well, my daughter got in with a 665. So that's sort of on the higher end. So again, this is parent reported. This is nothing official. This is an idea. And that Bronx Science high score should be 696, not what it says there. And so these are scores. You can Google this, you can find this online. Again, self-reported, so I don't want you to think that these are anything official. And these are from 2020. Those scores came out recently, so this information is pretty fresh. And again, those highs and lows change from one year to the next. Just some basic tips and strategies. Try to practice within the time frame. The DOE puts out 2 practice tests, and those are great to take and learn from. I wouldn't take them right off the bat. Maybe study a little bit and use it really as a practice. And then you can use one and then study some more and take the next one as practice. You can learn a lot from the practice tests. Your child should try to take it under real testing conditions instead of taking a section here and a section there. It's like training for a marathon. You got to practically go out and run a marathon first. So sitting for the full 3 hours to practice is really important. There's strategies that you can learn about how to guess, the best way to guess, how to eliminate answers, when you should move on. That sort of thing is something that you can work on if you take a class, or if you work with one of our tutors. You could learn yourself. There's books, but that's a strategy that's very effective. There's no penalty for wrong answer, so you should always bubble in. Of course, reading each question carefully, that's a good test taking tip for any test that you take. It is important to be familiar with each of the question types, and learn not just the content, but also the strategies for each type of question. And again, as I mentioned before, there are field test questions on each section, but it's important to just ignore that and just plow through all the questions as if each one counts. General testing strategies, cramming doesn't work. It's a little bit of a challenge with the timing of this test because it's given in October. If it's possible for your child, if their schedule allows for them to study a little bit over the summer, that helps a little bit. Sometimes students will start when school starts, but that's a lot to start at the beginning of the school year. It's a lot when you're starting your school year as well. Again, using the Department of Ed tests for practice, figuring out what order you want to take the test. Do you want to do the math section first or the ELA section first? It's really, that part is up to you. There's plenty of time between now and October, so just relax. And that's really it. Here is my contact information for Appleruth, and I'm going to turn it back over to Maurice now.
Okay, thanks, Jill. So we're just going to talk for a few more minutes and shift gears a little bit back to the main public high school applications. So just to refresh your memory, we talked about 3 categories of public Department of Education schools that you may consider applying to. One is all of the regular public high schools throughout the city. There are hundreds of them. The second category is the SHSAT schools, the 8 of the 9 specialized high schools. And the third category is the 9th specialized high school, which is LaGuardia, which are 3 separate lists, 3 separate applications. So I want to shift gears back to the regular application, the application of 12, which everybody should be completing. Eventually, what's going to happen in the fall of 8th grade is your child and your family will have access to the online application system, which by now you may know is called the My School system. And the My School system is really, if you know that the DOE used to have a big, huge phone book like looking thing from several years back, that was the high school directory. That is now online, and My Schools is essentially the online high school directory. Now, this is something that you can go onto right now and start perusing and start reviewing schools and start looking at the landscape and start, sorting and filtering the kinds of schools that you're interested in. There is no login required. You can go to myschools.nyc anytime you want, even before the fall of 8th grade. But what's going to happen, and I actually recommend doing that just to familiarize yourself with the system. But what's going to happen in the fall of 8th grade is you'll be able to log into the system, and at that point in September, you'll be able to do things like register for the SHSAT, register for LaGuardia, and start filling out your application, the list of 12. So the screen that you're looking at in front of you is kind of a sample screen, the kind of thing that you might look at when you're searching for schools and when you're adding programs to the application, literally with the click of a button. Now, what's going to happen for the list of 12, the infamous public high school application with 12 spots on it? There are a lot of misconceptions and myths about how to fill out this list of 12. So I'm going to give you a really quick kind of introduction right now. There are some basics to this list of 12. Number one is you want to get as close to 12 that you're willing to consider as you possibly can. Why? Because for most kids across the city, there's no guarantee. Unless you have a zoned high school that you're willing to consider applying to that zone program, or if you're applying to your own school that might continue from middle school to high school, so a continuing middle school to high school that gives you a guarantee, unless you have those 2 guarantees, there is no guarantee. So I want to be able to fill out as many of these choices as possible to make sure that I'm maximizing my chances of getting matched to one of my choices. Because what happens is when this mysterious algorithm does its thing, it starts at the top of your list and is counting on you to rank your choices from 1st to 12th in your true preference order. It starts at the top of your list and it tries to see if it can match you while it's working its way down. So if I don't get one of my top 4, 5, 6 choices, well, I better darn well make sure that I have something below that, because if I have any blank spots below that, what happens is the DOE is going to give me a school. I don't want that to happen. So the first general rule of thumb is I want to get as close to 12 as possible. Now I can tell you that number one, you should not put something down you have no interest in just to fill a spot. because whatever's on the application is fair game. But at the same time, you want to stretch yourself as much as you possibly can to give yourself as much cushion and backup as you possibly can. Statistically, last year, and this tends to be the case most every year, for students that put down 12 choices, nearly 97%, 98% of them get matched to one of their 12 choices. So if you put down 12 choices, that bodes well. But again, don't put something down you have zero interest in. That's a no-no. The second rule of thumb is you want to have a well-rounded list. You want to have some backups. You want to have some schools that are not super highly selective. So the illustration I put in front of you kind of tries to underline that point. Student A is a student that filled out the application with 8 of the 12 spots, so they left 4 spots blank. And they only filled up those 8 spots with really, really highly selective, academically screened programs for which they might have a chance, but they're competing against a lot of other kids, and it's really, really tough to get into that program on the basis of sheer demand or selection criteria, whatever the school is looking for, however they assess candidates, or maybe even on the basis of priority structure, where I might fall into a lower priority structure because of schools that might give priority on the basis of free or reduced price lunch, or might give priority on the basis of students who already go to their middle school that continues to high school. So there are priority structures that I also want to pay attention to. But the point is that for student A, they only filled up 8 slots and they're basically taking their chances. Student B, on the other hand, you can see there are some big differences. Number one, they filled up all 12 spots. Number two, it is a very well-rounded application. So they picked some highly selective schools. They also picked some less selective schools. They gave themselves some backup. They have a well-rounded application. They're choosing different types of programs that assess candidates in different ways. Some screen programs, some audition programs, some programs that are open or lottery programs. This is a well-rounded application. Now, we don't expect you to master all these concepts in one night or even in a couple months, frankly. We encourage you to take advantage of the expertise that you have in your school, to use your counselor, to use folks like us, but don't go it alone, because frankly, it is a very individualized kind of thing where a well-rounded application for one student may not necessarily be a well-rounded application for another student. So really consider this to be a team effort and use the experts that you have at your disposal. Now, ultimately in the spring of 8th grade, for the public results, and this is happening as we speak. So this year, a little bit different. The SHSAT results came out separately, but in a normal year, everything comes out at once. There's only one round of results, and you can see the different scenarios. So there are some students like student A and student B that got multiple offers. They might have got an offer from LaGuardia, and they got an offer from an SHSAT school, and they got matched to something from their list of 12. So student A was able to choose between 3 offers. Student B similarly was able to choose between 2 offers. Student C just got an offer to a specialized high school, as did student D. Now that doesn't happen a lot, but it sometimes happens if a student doesn't get something from their list of 12. Most students across the city get something from their list of 12 and fall into category E, student E. They don't get an offer from a specialized high school. These are very selective schools, but they get something from their list of 12. And then every year, there's a relatively small percentage, maybe 3-4% of the city, that don't get either a specialized high school or anything from their list of 12. Now, you all have the opportunity to not be in that category, but I just want to be fully transparent that every year there's a very small percentage of kids that fall into that category. And when that happens, the DOE will give you an assigned high school, which is obviously not what we want to have to happen to anybody. The DOE's ultimate objective is to match everybody to one of their choices. So, we can do a whole in fact, in a couple of weeks, I'm doing a complete webinar on what happens after results come out on May 10th. You're welcome to go to my website and sign up for that. But we can do a whole webinar on the waitlist process. I'm not going to be able to spend a lot of time on that, but I'll answer some questions if you'd like. But I just wanted to give you a sense of the staggered nature of how results are distributed in the spring of 8th grade. And then before Jill and I take some questions. So this is pretty typical, where in January of 8th grade, parochial or Catholic high school results come out. In February, most of the independent day school results come out. In March, in a normal year, public school results come out and boarding school results come out. In April, normally charter school results come out. This year, the SHSAT scores came out, but that was mostly because of COVID. And this year, the regular public high school results, including LaGuardia, are very late this year and are coming out in May. So just some quick next steps, and then we'll take some questions. So if you're a seventh grade family, you know, I tend to look at this in baby steps because I think it helps families gain the most control and also minimize the anxiety that can go along with this process. I think some of the most important things you can focus on right now is, number one, starting to familiarize yourself with some of the key resources, websites, insideschools.org, my schools, you know, maybe a resource like the Parents League for private schools, getting in the loop with DOE announcements, starting to jot down names of schools while casting a wide net. It's still not really premature to start narrowing down your list. I strongly consider families to consider going to some virtual open houses in May. Now, there aren't a lot of public high schools. The NYC high school is one that just came out with one recently, but there aren't a lot of public high schools that have open houses in May and June. There might be a few here or there, so be on the lookout for them. However, there are a good number of private schools that have open houses in May, so I encourage you to consider going to them, even if private high schools are not your preference, or if you're not considering private high schools. It's not a bad idea just to see what these events are like and to get your feet wet a little bit, including having your kids attend these events and start to get used to what they're like. I also think it's important to you know, consider what your plans might end up being for your kids if they're interested in applying to schools that require a test, particularly the SHSAT, to talk to Apple Ruth about those plans, and to consider whether or not your kids might end up auditioning for any performing or fine arts programs. And these are just, as I said, some of the key resources that you may find yourself using, including those for private schools like Ravenna, which you'll use in the fall, the public school system. The key website that I didn't mention before for Catholic schools is taxinfo.com, which has a lot of useful information about what it means to apply to the Catholic high schools and take the tax exam. Boardingschoolreview.com for boarding schools. And there's one centralized application system for a lot of the charter schools, and that's called nyccharterschools.org. Again, that's a really easy process, and you have to apply by April of 8th grade. So with that, I think we'll take some questions, right, Jill?
Yes, I just answered a couple, and I think they just go to the sender of the question, but can you see the Q&A, Maurice? If not, I can read them out loud.
I actually cannot, unfortunately.
Okay, so the first question is, are charter schools in my schools? How do we filter for charter schools? So
that's a great question. Charter schools are not in my schools because it's a separate application process. However, if you go to a site like insideschools.org, charter schools are there. And that's one way that, you know, if you're just starting to develop your list of schools, including charter schools, that's insideschools.org is a great tool to use. They have a great guided search tool that you can use to start to put together a list of schools. So that's one good resource to start your search. Another good resource is the website that I just mentioned, which is nyccharterschools.org. But no, my schools, charter schools are not part of the My Schools system.
Okay, the next question is, what bucket is BARD in?
So BARD is a regular New York City public high school. So BARD is listed among the list of 12 that I keep talking about. So the application, the main application that has the 12 choices on it, that's where not only BARD, but that's where every program other than the specialized high schools are listed among the DOE public high school programs.
Next question. And I don't know if you want to start, I'm not sure we want to start going into specifics about specific schools. Someone did inquire about Townsend Harris, so maybe you could talk about, they said, do you have any information about Townsend Harris?
I mean, I'm not in this forum. I'm happy to talk to you individually. I'm not in this forum going to talk about individual schools. I'm not sure if the question is related to the application process, but Townsend Harris has been in some flux among a lot of other schools in terms of its admissions process, and I expect that will continue into the new year. Traditionally, Townsend Harris is one of the most selective high schools in the city in terms of academic criteria, and their priority structure has also been somewhat in flux. So it's a little bit uncertain in terms of what their process is going to look like for this year. Townsend Harris and many of the other super selective academically screened public schools in New York City. And just by the way, Townsend Harris is also listed on that main application because it is not a specialized high school.
Okay, next question. If we apply for private and SHSAT, do we have to commit to private before we find out about SHSAT results?
Well, that's a great question. So in a normal year, private high school results mostly come out in February. And the SHSAT results, along with all the other public results, typically come out in March. So they tend to be a lot closer in a more normal year than this year. And this year, it was really tough for families because there was a major lag between the private school offers, and many families had to put down a lot of money and make commitments financially and otherwise to private schools, and still do not know the results of the public school applications, even though they may have their SHSAT results. So we'll see what it's like next year. Hopefully it will revert more back to normal, where they're closer together and there's not as much of a lag. So it tends to not be as much of an issue as it was this year. So hopefully we'll revert back to a more normal schedule next year.
Okay, this next question comes from a student. I'm currently an 8th grade student awaiting school results. For instance, Townsend Harris is accepting students with free lunch for 50% of their seats. If not all students with free lunch fit their academic criteria, will anyone with free lunch who will fit that criteria automatically get in?
So, so there are a number of schools across thank you, by the way. We love when students are on the line, and that's a fabulous question. There are a number of schools across the city that are part of what the DOE calls the Diversity in Admissions program, which is otherwise called the DIA program. And Townsend Harris is one of them, and there are many more schools this year. So these schools are giving priority to students who are eligible for free and reduced price lunch on the basis of federal income guidelines. So basically they allocate a certain percentage of seats and prioritize those seats for students that fall into that category. So a question that often comes up, and I think this is what the student is getting to, is if those seats don't fill up with qualified applicants, what happens? And the answer is that what we expect to happen, and what the DOE has told us, is that those seats, then the applicant pool will open up to everybody, including free and reduced price lunch, but also other applicants that might be eligible on the basis of that school's criteria. So, but we'll see. I mean, for a school like Townsend Harris, it's going to depend on, it very much depends on the school as well. For a school like Townsend Harris, a really, really highly sought after school, I think it's a reasonable assumption that their seats, their allocation of seats for free and reduced price lunch students will fill up. But this is the first time that programs like that have those significant allocations that hadn't had them before. So it's anybody's guess how that's going to play out.
Great. With so many schools going lottery for students with grades above certain threshold, are there any safe schools?
Well, so, first of all, we don't know what the criteria are going to be for schools this year, even though this past year, it is true that there were a larger number of schools that had what I call a sort of a hybrid academic screening. So basically they might have said something like, as long as you have 85 and above, we're going to throw you into a pool. And then after that, it's the luck of the draw. We'll see what happens for next year. But in terms of selectivity and how hard it is to get into individual programs, that's only one component. The other things that factor into how hard it is to get into a program or a school include the sheer demand, applicants to seats, priority structure. There are lottery numbers that are assigned in some cases. So there are a lot of components that determine how hard it is to get into a school. But as far as determining what schools might give you more backup, what schools might give you more well-balanced application, I highly recommend, and I don't mean to avoid the question, but I highly recommend that you speak to a counselor or another expert that can tell you what might represent a backup or give you more balance for your individual child's applications, because it can be different from application to application to application. But there are certainly schools out there that can give you more backup. The challenge very often becomes, how do I fill up all 12 spots and give myself backup at the same time? It's one thing to fill up all 12 spots with 12 of the most selective schools in the city, but that's not necessarily a good strategy. You want to have some backup. So what the hard conversations tend to be before applications are due, can I, sort of thread that needle where I'm filling up all 12, but at the same time, I'm giving myself some backup and still willing to consider the schools that I'm putting on the bottom of my application.
This is a very simple question, but it sounds like the answer will be helpful to people. We live in Brooklyn, but can we apply to public high school in Manhattan?
So I'm actually glad that somebody asked that question, because the DOE has gone on record as saying that geographic priority structure for the high school application process will be eliminated this year. So for current 7th grade families that are applying in the fall, our expectation, now, could this change? Could the DOE change course? Absolutely. But they've gone on record as saying that geographic priority will be phased out completely. So my expectation, I have every reason to believe that that means that the answer is yes, that wherever you live in the city, you can apply to schools in different parts of the city and will not be at a disadvantage on the basis of where you live or go to school because of some kind of previous geographic priority. Now, this is this is our expectation. This is what the DOE has said. So we'll see how this goes. But I think that if I'm a 7th grade family right now and I'm starting to develop my list of schools, I'm definitely keeping that in the back of my head that, what, all of a sudden, maybe if I'm a Brooklyn family, I might consider a Manhattan school that previously was kind of off limits because it only admitted kids from Manhattan, or vice versa. If I'm a Manhattan family, I'm looking at Brooklyn, or whatever the case may be, whatever borough I'm talking about. So I think that bodes well, especially because, as everyone probably knows, this past year, district and catchment area priority was eliminated. So if I'm in an area of the city where I no longer have priority for my own district or my own catchment area, while that is not necessarily a good thing, it is a good thing that there will be no longer borough priority for schools across the city. So.
Okay, great. Because someone did ask about the district priority, so that's been answered. Someone said, okay, this is a long one. Isn't Gen Ed public simply a lottery at this point between batch grading, standardized testing likely not counting, no zoning priority, and what I've heard about schools such as Beacon doing away with interviews? What is there to do besides having a well-rounded list?
Well, I think there's no disrespect at all, but I think there's a misconception that the high school application process is now just one complete lottery, and that's absolutely not true. There are plenty of schools that still have some kind of academic criteria, even if it's what I'm calling the hybrid academic screen, but there are plenty of schools that have some kind of screen, including audition programs, which still require an audition. So, again, we'll see what happens coming into the new year. Is it possible that the DOE continues down this road of, phasing out some certain academic screens? It is certainly possible. I mean, as you know, for the middle school admissions process this past year, all academic screens were suspended. So there were no academic screens for the middle school admissions process this past year. So we'll see what happens for the high school application process. But you're right. Also, because I'm sort of reading into the question, you're right also that a well-rounded application is not only based on academic criteria, but also based on the things that I've been mentioning: demand, applicants per seats, and priority structure, not just geographic priority structure, but any other kind of priority structure. And for schools like, Beacon and other schools that had some kind of extra requirement, whether or not they still have an extra requirement this year, whether it's a portfolio, an interview, whatever the case may be. We'll see how that goes. We don't know yet for sure. Excuse me.
Is it true that high school admissions letters typically come out on Fridays? Someone asks.
Not necessarily. No.
And that's actually the last question that we have right now in the Q&A. If anyone wants to jump in, we have a few minutes left. If anyone has any more questions. Oh, here comes another question. Is there a way to assess historical school demand from the Inside Schools website or some other resource?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for asking that. Yeah, if you go into the My School system, and again, you can go on right now if you want to, you don't need to log in. You can see last year's numbers in terms of applicants, the number of seats, and the overall demand. I mean, I think one of the things that I like that the DOE instituted a few years back was they started to give this applicant to seat ratio, which is gives you some level of understanding about demand for a particular program. What I don't like, and my hope is that they decide to do, because even when I was with the DOE, we talked about doing something like this. It doesn't tell you how many of the number of applicants, of the number of students that are applying to that program, how many are applying to that program as their first through third choice? How many are applying to that program as their 9th through 12th choice? Is that program mostly getting applicants that are applying to them as their top choice or not? Because that can also, the numbers can be misleading. There was an article recently that was put out by, I believe, at a professor at Columbia University that talked to this point, where they said that these numbers can seem really overwhelming, but in some ways are misleading, because there might be really, really high applicant to seat ratios, but in fact, many of those could have, for some programs, not for all, but for some programs, could have applied to that program as one of their bottom choices, or not even fulfilled the criteria that the school required, and thus basically taking them out of the applicant pool for that school. So the numbers in some cases can be misleading.
What factors of a student's portfolio or profile is available to admissions officers during the screenings?
What criteria? So, in terms of how school screen programs are assessing portfolios or other parts of whatever the school requires as part of their selection criteria, it really depends on the school and what they require. So that's just because Beacon came up. Let's take Beacon, for example. I mean, Beacon historically has always required some kind of, I'll call it an academic portfolio. So basically you submit an academic portfolio and the school reviews it. And every school is supposed to have their rubric by which you can, it's supposed to be pretty transparent in terms of how they're assessing your portfolio. And that is taken into account when the school is, ranking candidates. Now, this past year, it just so happens Beacon didn't pay any attention to academic criteria. All they cared about was their portfolio. For other schools, it might be different. There were some schools like Manhattan Hunter Science and School of the Future and Bard that had their own criteria. So each school is a little bit different. Each school's rubric is a little bit different. So I encourage you, if there are these same kind of criteria this year, and you can get a sense of that both in the My School system right now, you can get a sense of what the rubrics were, as well as on school websites, but just keep in the back of your head that they may or may not stay the same, remain the same way. They may or may not remain identical for current 7th grade families going into next year. So those rubrics can change from year to year to year. But if you go onto My Schools and the school websites, they'll definitely give you a sense of what their requirements were this year and what their rubrics were and how much weight was placed on each component and, how they actually assessed candidates, because the city requires that the schools be as transparent as they possibly can with those policies.
Maurice, someone asked about the matching algorithm for the normal public schools, not the specialized schools.
I could spend probably hours just talking about that, but the basics.
Maybe that's for a separate private conversation.
Maybe for a separate. I mean, it really depends on which aspect of the algorithm that you're talking about. But I think some of the key strategies that we talked about tonight, making sure that you're completing your list of 12 in your true order of preference is really important, because that's the order that the algorithm goes in. Regardless of selectivity, you know, you don't want to game the system. You don't want to try to game the system. The computer algorithm is counting on you listing in your true order of preference. And having a well-balanced application, you know, you're going to be, I guess the other thing I should mention is there's a blind ranking process. So however you're ranked, whatever their school's rubric is, however the DOE is ranking candidates, whether on the basis of a lottery or academic criteria or whatever the ranking process is, it's a blind ranking process. So in other words, if you, wherever you list a program on your application, whether it's first or sixth or 12th, you're not going to be penalized just because of where you listed that program on your application. So you could list the program 12th on your application. Number one, the high school is not going to know. So you should not feel pressure to put something first because you think the high school is going to know that you put it first or not, because they don't. But number two is you're not going to be penalized just because you put something lower by the ranking process. So, you know, those are a couple of the more basic concepts of the algorithm. You know, we can do a whole webinar on the lottery numbers and how they're assigned, but I invite families, actually, there's a really good really good video on the DOE website. I think they do a really good job of explaining how lottery numbers are assigned. So I encourage you to go to the DOE website and check out that video.
Okay, I think that about wraps up the hour. There's a couple of more questions on there. If your question did not get answered, I encourage you to reach out to me or to Maurice, depending on who the question was for, and we'll be happy to help you afterwards. Again, just letting you know that this has been recorded and it will be sent to you in the next couple of days. Feel free to share it with your friends. And again, I encourage you to reach out to us if you have any more questions. Thank you so much, Maurice. That was so great, so helpful.
Oh, thank you, Jill.
Everyone learned a lot, and thanks so much, and good night.
It was a pleasure. Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
Okay.